My name is Jack Stein, and I am the son of Morris and Michelle Stein. My father was a Holocaust survivor who passed away at the age of 85 in 2014. The years growing up with my mom, dad, brother, and sister in Israel and in the United States were filled with joy, but there was always the dark cloud of the Holocaust and its impact on my father. It was difficult for my father to talk about the Holocaust, but my brother managed to compile a document that describes my father's Holocaust experience during his childhood. This written document of my dad's experiences during the Holocaust is all that remains for us. The links to the various resources about my father's experiences during the Holocaust are in the following slide. What you see on the screens are resources that you can go and connect to on the web. The first one is the actual autobiography. The second one is part of the story that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has put together and compiled on their website about my father's story. And the third one is a document that you'll see. It's a PDF file that the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust has published and is available for you to read in detail all of my father's background and experience during the Holocaust. My father survived 4 concentration camps and labor camps as a young child, but lost his entire family during the Holocaust. He immigrated to England and then to Israel after the war ended and married my mom, who was born in Israel, and he had 3 children. We immigrated to the United States in 1960. He was a wonderful father and a great husband, but the Holocaust tainted his entire life. I am a participant in the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust. I have 3 children, 2 granddaughters, and a grandson. I am involved as a volunteer with the Habitat for Humanity building houses in Charlotte and North Carolina and Concord, North Carolina. My wife and I live in Concord, and I am currently retired from a long career in the computer software industry. First, I want to share with you that I have presented what you are about to hear and see throughout North Carolina in schools and other venues. I have also presented in other states. I've done this since 2016, and each time I do the presentation, it takes a toll on me emotionally. My wife has been with me throughout all these presentations, and she sees my emotional pain afterwards. I've chosen to cut back on my presentation schedule, but I want to make sure that the story is not forgotten. Thus, I created this presentation electronically to share with students, teachers, my family, and others who are interested in this topic. Keep in mind that many of the survivors have passed and that the second generation, like me, will also pass. The motto of never again needs to stay active with every generation. I hope that as you hear my presentation and read about my father's Holocaust experience, it has a profound impact on you in some fashion. And thank you in advance for being willing to listen to and to see my presentation. This presentation is dedicated to my father. Without any further delay, let me start. I did not know about my father's Holocaust experience until I was in my 40s when I read his autobiography entitled Reflection on Hell. The topic was never discussed at home as I grew up, but we had some clues that bad things happened. The Holocaust scarred my father for life, and I was told by my mother that my father would wake up at night screaming from the nightmares of the horrible memories of his Holocaust days. It eventually became clear to me that my father did not have a normal childhood, and as such, I would always give him my love and a pass on everything. I always ask myself, how did this happen? History shows that the Holocaust followed the following stages. Stage 1 was the exclusion stage. It went from 1933 to 1935. In that stage, laws were enacted to exclude and segregate Jews. The beginning of burning of Jewish books and the Nuremberg race laws were enacted. These laws stated that German Jews were stripped of citizenship And Jews were also banned from voting or holding public office. There was also the banning of marriage between Jews and non-Jews. And then started the concentration camps, and they were springing up throughout Germany. The next stage was a persecution stage from 1935 to 1939. In this stage, German Jewish property and businesses are seized. Also occurring was Kristallnacht, and more concentration camps were springing up throughout Germany. An Avian conference was held where international leaders attempted to deal with the tremendous load of Jewish refugees, but there was no resolution. And the next stage was the expulsion stage from 1939 through 1941. As more countries are taken over by Germany, the Jews are encouraged to leave Germany. Poland is singled out. The transition to ghettos and then to death camps starts to occur. The final stage, appropriately named the final solution, from 1941 through 1945. In this stage, it was a systematic process of large-scale extermination, where Jews were forced into labor camps. Inhumane condition occurred in these camps, and then the executions and termination of life for those who were deemed undesirable. This is the phase that my father experienced. What happened in each phase was clearly known to the world. The outcome was the mass murder of some 6 million European Jews and many other individuals deemed undesirable by Nazi Germany. You have to wonder, as I do, how my father managed to survive on his own these horrible events of the Holocaust. Was it inner strength, luck, or divine intervention, or a combination of all three? To start off, I will share and read to you a section from the introduction of my father's autobiography. This is my story of the Holocaust, in short, without all the details of my personal sufferings and of what I have seen others suffer in Poland and in Germany, in 4 concentration camps. I tell it even though I never like to talk about my past and what I lived through, because whenever I start talking about those horrific times in my life, I feel like I'm living it through again in real. But now, some of my children and grandchildren ask me to somehow tell them about my past in the camps. Since they saw the movie Schindler's List, their interest in the Jewish suffering increased. Some of the sufferings each one of us survivors lived through were so savage that it is hard to believe that human beings are capable of causing such horrible things to other human beings. Up to date, occasionally I dream about the camps I was in, and in a short time I lived through a big part of those horrors, and I start yelling in my sleep, so loud that my wife wakes me up, so that the neighbors shouldn't think that something else is happening in our house. My father was born in 1928 as Morris Stein in an undeveloped farming community in Poland. He had 2 sisters and 1 brother. None of them, other than my father, survived the Holocaust. My father was the youngest. The photograph you see on the screen of his family is all we have. From left to right, they are his older sister, Itka, his mother, Hinda. There's my dad, Mosek, his older brother, Meyer, his father, Jacob, and his younger sister, Chaki. My father also shared with us that the letters KL tattooed and inscribed on his left forearm was done when he was imprisoned in the concentration camp. The KL stands for concentration lager, which means concentration camp in German. You may have also seen pictures of survivors who have a number tattooed in their arm. It was only after I read his autobiography later in life that I found out the following. My father was about 13 years old when he was captured by the Nazis and imprisoned from 1941 through 1945 and placed in 4 concentration and labor camps in Poland and finally in Germany. The slide you're seeing is a map that shows the location of the various camps that my father was in and the duration. Notice the proximity of Daku to Flossenburg, about 120 miles. During this time, he witnessed the barbarian behavior in the camps, the unbelievable inhumanity that can be inflicted on others, including executions, starvation, beatings, and medical mistreatment. His father, mother, and brother, and two sisters never made it to the camps. By choice, they hid and fought in the underground against the Nazis, but were captured and executed by the Nazis. He was on his own and he felt helpless and despondent. When I think about my father as a 13-year-old, it is hard to imagine a child being imprisoned in a concentration camp. Let me read to you a quote from his autobiography that captures what my father felt when he found out his entire family was gone. In the first two camps, there were some of my relatives and some of my hometown people. Some of them were brought to the camp after I was, and I found out that my brother had been caught in the woods with a rifle and the Germans had executed him. Then my father got injured in an operation with the Germans, and he went to stay with my mother and sister on a farm. And one day, the Polish police, together with the Gestapo, attacked the place and killed them all. My other sister was also killed while in the underground organization. That is all I know, and what I was told by the people from our hometown and relatives that came to the camp after me. After all that, my personal life became meaningless, and I didn't care if I were to die today or live to the next day. Some days, I wished to get it over with. All that suffering, but I didn't know how. My mind and my thoughts were occupied with how to fill my stomach because I was hungry most of the time. I had nobody to talk to. The people I came with were all strangers, and so were the ones that were in the camp before us. And besides, everybody else's problems were similar to mine. His last concentration camp and labor camp was at Flossenburg. At Flossenburg, my father was one of the fortunate ones that worked on building airplane components for the German fighter planes, the Messerschmitt. Other prisoners worked in the back-breaking granite quarry. Conditions were inhumane in this camp, with limited food, no medical care, and unimaginable overcrowding of the prisoners. There were about 30 barracks, and each one was only built to handle 100 prisoners. But at its peak, the camp held close to 15,000 prisoners, over 5 times the capacity of the barracks. Escaping the camp was punishable by death if you were captured, which was very likely. About 96,000 prisoners passed through Flossenburg. About 30,000 of them died there. The slide you are about to see depict the condition at Flossenburg camp. This one shows the inside of the barracks. The next one shows you the cremation oven. And the next one shows you the condition of what they found during liberation of the prisoners. Here's an example of what the prisoner looked like. And finally, the last one shows you the discarded shoes of those who perished. Notice the height of the pile compared to the soldiers. As World War II in Europe was drawing to an end, the Nazi camp guards attempted to escape the American forces by marching many prisoners to another concentration camp, the Dachau camp. My father and many other prisoners were forced on the death march from Flossenburg for about 2 weeks. Dachau was a full-scale Nazi extermination facility with gas chambers to kill the prisoners and crematoriums to cremate the bodies. The march was a brutal one, and many of the marching prisoners were killed by the Nazi guards. Luckily, because of the American military, the march ended before they got to Dachau. Had they made it to Dachau, the prisoners would have been gassed and cremated. I would not be here today if this march came to fruition. When liberation came in April of 1945, it was difficult for the survivors to grasp what a future life was going to look like. Let me read to you how my father felt at this point of his life, as well as throughout the later years. Every one of us survivors has suffered in those few years in camp, more than anyone can imagine. Lots of times, even now, I sometimes wonder how different my whole life would have been if I had my parents and brother and sisters and I had grown up in a family, but I guess I will never know. When liberation came in April of 1945, my father, who was at this point 17 years old, and many other surviving Holocaust children spent some time in special facilities to handle displaced children. One of these was a monastery called Kloster Indersdorf near Dachau, Germany. The slide you see up here is a photograph showing the displaced children and some of the individual that helped manage Kloster Indersdorf. And in particular, I would like you to just pay attention to the individual in the front. And his name is Steve. And this individual here is going to play a key part later on in our life. And here's my father in the back here. Kloster Indersdorf was managed by the international team of social workers from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration to help the displaced children, both Jewish and non-Jewish, after they survived and witnessed the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust. Their focus was to address the needs of the displaced children, from basic needs such as proper nutrition, medical and hygiene, to the emotional needs of being cared for and reestablishing a bond of trust. The ultimate goal was to assimilate the children back into a new life by finding any of their remaining family or relatives. For the Polish Jewish surviving children, it was likely that they had no family left. Let's go and show you how identification was done in the next slide. Okay, to help with identifying the displaced children, photos were taken and were distributed throughout Europe. If anyone knew the displaced child, they would have a way to contact the appropriate organization to give more details. My father realized that he had no immediate family left, so he volunteered and he was selected to go to England at the age of 17 in 1945. He was in England for 3 years, and at the age of 20, my father decided that he wanted to go to Israel and to begin a new life to start a family. My father settled in Israel in 1948, was a soldier in the Israeli army, as you can see in the photo on your left, top left, got married and had three children. I was the oldest. As you can see, there's a photo of my dad with me in both the top right and in a bottom center of pictures with my dad. That's me over there. Our family immigrated to the United States in 1960. Steve, the individual that was in Kloster Indersdorf with my dad, helped us quite a bit. I was 10 years old. This began a new chapter of our life. After my father passed away in 2014, I was eager to learn more about his life during the Holocaust. An opportunity came up in 2015 when we went to Germany to see my daughter, who was stationed with the Air Force. I was able to visit 2 facilities that my father stayed at and was guided by 2 wonderful Germans, Anna Andelor and her husband. Anna wrote a book about Kloster Indersdorf and its role in handling the displaced children of the Holocaust. This book was the basis of a traveling exhibit called Life After Survival. The exhibit is available from the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust to North Carolina schools for display. Let me review with you my experience through these photos of Flossenburg camp. In this slide, you see the Flossenburg concentration camp has been named a memorial camp, and it's all that remains of the last concentration camp that my father was at before the American military arrived and liberated the camp. As I walked around the camp, visiting the shower facility, seeing the granite quarry where some of the prisoners labored, seeing the Valley of the Death, and the towering guard stations, I could not imagine what my father might have felt when he walked the same grounds as a camp prisoner. But trying to grasp and comprehend the horror that my father experienced is impossible. Emotionally, I was shaken by what I saw, both in the physical layout of the camp and in the photos on display, which depicted the horrible conditions in the camp, the atrocities that were committed. I felt that I was in a place where evil existed. It was raining during this visit, and it symbolized to me that the rain was the tears of all those who perish in this evil place. I could not comprehend how such atrocities and inhumane acts were allowed to happen. I then visited the facility where my father stayed after liberation. The monastery was called Kloster Indersdorf and was set up to deal with displaced children who survived the Holocaust. This was a more upbeat visit. I spent considerable time reading about the Holocaust. You probably have read the book Night by Elie Wiesel. Elie describes the horrors he witnessed during his exposure to the Holocaust as a young boy. Here's a profound quote that I want to share with you. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget the smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transform into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even if I were condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. After I returned home from my visit to Germany, I contacted the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and they were able to trace and provide documents that showed the records kept by the concentration camps where my father was placed. They worked with me to document the story of my father. This was part of their Remember Me initiative to identify children who were displaced. The picture I shared with you in my previous slides of my father at Kloster Indersdorf helped me identify my father in the Remember Me photo list. I encourage you and your family to visit the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. The photo you see is of me at the United Nations, and the photo behind me is that of what you saw earlier, where my father, Steve, were at the Kloster Indersdorf Displaced Children Facility. I attended the UN in 2016 UN Holocaust Remembrance with my wife in late January of 2016 in New York. And that left me in tears as I heard firsthand testimony in the General Assembly from survivors of the Holocaust, as well as from those who bravely defied the directives from the Nazis and saved the lives of many at risk of losing their lives. They are known as the righteous ones. Now, remember Steve that I told you about earlier? Well, here's a photo of him at the UN. As I wind down my presentation, I would like to share with you a few slides. This is a photo with my parents, my mom on the left, my dad on the right, with my daughter, who's in the Air Force, and our granddaughter, Chloe. The next slide you'll see is a photo of my mom and my dad, and I am in the middle, sitting in our home in Concord, North Carolina. My father had a hard life and survived the most horrible conditions of the Holocaust, but he did succeed in having a wonderful and caring wife, a family of 3 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. His legacy and the lessons he instilled in me are still with me. I continue to read historical views of the Holocaust and have gained a deeper understanding of its roots and how it evolved and the circumstances that enabled it. Unfortunately, I see a world, including this country, that is plagued by hatred, anti-Semitism, and various forms of Holocaust denial. I see how we express out of fear our distaste for groups of people who are different from us. The Holocaust is a lesson about evil, about the failure of nations and institutions, about consequences of indifference, about choices of individuals and responsibility. I hope that each of you will understand the suffering and pain that affected so many people during the Holocaust, and that you make sure a Holocaust or a genocide never happens again. You will be a witness to events in your life that will put you in a position to make choices. Remember the past and learn from it. Choose the right and not the wrong. Choose truth and not lies. Choose what is good and not bad. Choose to be sympathetic, not apathetic. Our future, your future, depends on it. My father's story has profoundly changed me, and that I have become even more of a believer that nothing like the Holocaust should ever happen again. I cherish the following quote, and you may have heard this before. The only thing necessary for triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. I hope you cherish this quote as well, and that it strengthens you. Now it is all up to you. Thank you.